Hello and welcome. I'm Praveer, and today's session is Quaternary Interpretation of Quantum Dynamics and its Technological Implications. Now, over the next 20 minutes, what I'd like to do is begin with a fourfold structure of matter and life, transition to a fourfold structure from the bottom up, looking at possible dynamics of light. This will lead to quaternary interpretation of quantum dynamics, and then I'll cover some technological implications and then summarize and conclude. So beginning with fourfold structure of matter and life, the point of view here is that nature needs to be viewed as a single system. And why do I say that? Because we know that all quantum particles are sourced from the quantum levels. All atoms are sourced from quantum particles. All molecules are sourced from atoms. All molecular plants, that's the basis of living cells, are sourced from molecules. So it's evident that there is a tight integration between one layer of nature and the next. So the question is, why don't we study it as a single system when trying to get insight into one layer or another? So even if our interest is in understanding the quantum levels and in understanding quantum dynamics, I want to suggest that it's necessary to consider the quantum level integrated with the layers of physics, chemistry, and biology. And that's going to yield some additional insights into the nature of quantum dynamics, as I'm going to propose in just a minute here. Let's also remind ourselves of a quote by Erwin Schrödinger, Nobel laureate in physics. Quantum physics thus reveals a basic oneness of the universe. So let's begin with the process of reverse extrapolation to read the quantum levels. And here I'm going to start with the most granular of levels of living cells. And this can be plant cells, animal cells, or human cells. We know that all these cells are comprised of 4 molecular plans. And these molecular plans are known as proteins, polysaccharides, nucleic acids, and lipids. Now, when we penetrate into the essence of these different molecular plans, to understand and to denominate them in terms of their essential function, then we can say, for instance, that proteins, and here taking the example of a human cell, is over 30,000 different proteins. They exist ubiquitously across the cell. They're involved in all kinds of reactions, in all kinds of transfer of materials. And so we could say that the protein, in its essence, has this essential functionality of presence. Now, polysaccharides, we know, are chains of sugar molecules. They provide energy and power in a cell. So we could denominate its essential functionality in terms of something that we can call power. Nucleic acids, we know, are responsible for the creation of DNA, the libraries of the cells that house all the information about how all the components in the cells will act. And so we could say that nucleic acids, in its essence, has something to do with what we can call knowledge. And then when we think about lipids, then lipids create natural compartments in cells, and this allows work specialization. And so we can say that in its essence, lipids has something to do with, or can be denominated in terms of functionality that we can call harmony. Now, let's look at a layer deeper, so at the periodic table. And here we know that all known elements can be classified as D shell atoms, S shell atoms, P shell atoms, and F shell atoms. Now, similarly, if we look at D shell atoms, then we have here the components of all the heavy infrastructure that create cities, roadways, so elements like whether it's iron or nickel or cobalt or copper and so on. And so we get a sense that there's the essential functionality of presence that's covered by this category. Now, when we look at S shell atoms, then we have representative atoms like hydrogen and helium that we know power suns. They're responsible for nuclear fusion. So we get an intuitive sense that it has something to do with power. So we can denominate it in terms of this essential functionality of power. P-shell atoms, we can say they house both. There's archetypes, for example, metals, metalloids, non-metals, halogens, and so on. So there's a representation of different parts of the periodic table in that category of P-shell. And further, the basis of computing machinery, whether it's silicon or carbon, is also in that P-shell group. So we can say that it has something to do, or we can get an intuitive sense that somehow it houses or promotes this property of knowledge. And when we think about F-shell atoms, we know that this is an experiment in collectivity because we have the largest elements in terms of atomic number. And so we can say it has something to do with harmony. Now, when we go down a level further into the standard model and to the quantum particle level, we can similarly say that the Higgs boson has something to do with presence, because any quantum particle that has mass has to interact with the Higgs field through the Higgs boson. We can get a sense that the lepton has something to do with power, because we have electron as a surrogate for our lepton, and we know that the release or capture of any electron is always accompanied by power. And then when we think about quarks, we know that quarks are the key components in protons, and protons determine atomic number, and the atomic number of an element will define precisely its behavior in the universe. So it has something to do with this essence of functionality of knowledge. And when we think about bosons, we know that any quantum particles that interact with each other, that fuse with each other, they require the action of bosons, and so it has something to do with harmony. So the point here is that when we look at these different layers, so this layer of molecular plants, the layer of biology, the layer of the periodic table is of chemistry, we can say that the layer of quantum particles is of physics. When we cut across these layers, we see this similar fractal pattern that emerges. That's a fourfold functional pattern that we can call presence, power, knowledge, harmony. And so it stands to reason that this must originate from the quantum level. So this gives us a sense, when we reverse extrapolate, that there's a particular root pattern that shows up in fractal form at all these subsequent levels. Now, let's consider the fourfold structure from the bottom up. And here I'm going to take us through a hypothetical exercise with light occurring at different speeds. Now, we know, of course, that light in the physical universe in vacuum exists in a constant speed of 186,000 miles per second. But let's imagine that we have a large volume and there's a light source at the center of it, and that this light is traveling infinitely fast. Now, if it's traveling infinitely fast in this mind experiment, then we know that it's going to be present everywhere instantaneously, so it has a property of presence. We know that if anything not the nature of light were to arise, because it's going to be present everywhere at the same time, it's going to overpower any other surfacings. And so there's a property of power. Since light is ubiquitous instantaneously across this realm, anything that arises or disappears is going to happen in this fabric of light. So light's going to have a quote unquote knowledge. So there's this property of knowledge of everything that's happening in its realm. And since everything is connected to the nature of light, there's an implicit property of harmony. And so we see from this hypothetical experiment that light can be seen to have properties of presence, power, knowledge, harmony. Now, I want to suggest that even when we reduce the speed of light, so down to c, then symmetrically, we can see the same properties of presence, power, knowledge, harmony. And the quote-unquote proof of that is the exercise that we just went through when we looked at the fourfold structure that surfaces in matter and life. And so, assuming that all this is occurring in this realm where light is traveling at 186,000 miles per second, then what we might be able to intuit is that there's a symmetrical, these different properties that show up in matter are a symmetrical phase of some mathematical space created by imagining light to travel infinitely fast that also has the properties of presence, power, knowledge, and harmony. So if this is the case, then the way to think about quantum or a quanta is that if we think about this conceptual space where light travels infinitely fast, and then if we think about the space created when light travels at 186,000 miles per second, then quanta can be thought of as a mechanism that collects and materializes information in light. So everything that shows up materially is being parsed from the infinite amount of information that exists in that conceptual space where light's traveling infinitely fast. This, now, I'm going to dive into this in a little more detail. It gives rise to something that I'd call four-fold quantum object code. And so we have this realm, this conceptual space, this mathematical space that's created when light travels infinitely fast. We have a space where light exists at 186,000 miles per second, and we know that matter and life surface in there. And as we've seen, quanta can be thought of as parsing information in light from this vaster conceptual space of light into material and life forms, as we saw when we began the fourfold structure of matter and life. But let's think about what's required to actually get from the broader properties of presence, power, knowledge, and harmony that exist in this conceptual space to the materialized space, where also we see the symmetrical face of presence, power, knowledge, harmony. So if we were to mathematically move from one realm to the other, then we could say that what would first be required is some kind of slowdown of light, so still moving way faster than c, where there's a differentiation between, or a differentiation of the different properties that we intuited, for example, presence, power, knowledge, and harmony. So we know if something slows down, then if it's traveling infinitely fast, it's invisible, but when it slows down, something of it becomes visible. So when light slows down, we can say that whatever was contained in presence becomes a set of presence. So there's now up to an infinite number of elements that are contained in that set of presence. And similarly, we have a set of power, a set of knowledge, and a set of harmony that have many elements related to the concept of presence, power, knowledge, and harmony. And further, through another mathematical articulation or another act of quantization, where light slows down even further, we can imagine that the infinite number of elements in these four sets combined together in unique forms to create seeds. And then these seeds are parsed into form materially and in life. And so that's what arises in matter and life. And so we can mathematically set up a set of equations by which these four properties can create the infinite variety in matter and life. And if we think about the articulation of these subtle seeds, then this is the content, can be thought of as the content of space. When we think about time, we can think about the essence of what's contained in these seeds becoming more material through the process of time. We can think about the transformation from the subtlety to the materiality as being a process of energy. And we can think about any arrangement between seeds and seeds and seeds as being this thing that we call gravity. When we look further into what space-time, energy, and gravity are, we'd see that they are nothing other than a symmetrical face of the things that we're calling knowledge, power, harmony, and presence. And why is this? Because when we look at space, there's archetypes of many different things that show up. And so it's representative of a range of knowledge. When we think about time, then regardless of all obstacle, that which is in the essence of the seed will materialize. And so there's a display of power through time. When we think about energy, then that which is less material or subtle becoming material is an act of presence. And when we think about gravity, this is really about harmony. So what we're saying is that our fourfold aspects, the macro parameters by which we understand the cosmos, space-time, energy, gravity, is a fourfold quantum object code that is a symmetrical face of basically knowledge, power, presence, and harmony. So, let's summarize where we've been so far. So we started off with a light source, and in this light source, there were 4 different properties: presence, power, knowledge, harmony, that became 4 sets. These are 4 infinite sets depicted here, and they depict or differentiate or quantize what is meant by presence, power, knowledge, harmony. These become the basis of infinite light seeds. And if we think about light seeds as unique combinations of different elements, but if there's a seed that has predominantly the aspect of presence, but things from other sets as well, then it's depicted as the large PR. Power, the predominantly power seed by this kind of combination here, and so on. And so we can see then that any quantum object that shows up materially has these 4 coordinates or 4 aspects to its coding, which we can call energy, time, space, and gravity, that relate to presence, power, knowledge, and harmony. And we saw more concretely, when we consider the structure of matter, the fourfold structure that's related to energy, time, space, and gravity, or presence, power, knowledge, harmony, showing up in quantum particles, atoms, and molecular plans. And without going into it in any detail here, but I just want to indicate that we can make the same case about the structure of the electromagnetic spectrum and the structure of bosons, that similarly, they are an articulation or a materialization of these properties of presence, power, knowledge, and harmony. So moving forward, if we think about these as adjacent layers, then we have at the 0th layer, this quantum object code, and then layers 1 through 5, which is more sophisticated materializations. We have subsequently the electromagnetic spectrum, bosons, quantum particles, atoms, molecular plans, that are all arbitrating more of what presence, power, knowledge, harmony mean into material existence. And then if we look at imaginary layers, then we have the light seeds, and we have the light source, and then we have the presence, power, knowledge, harmony as the essential layer. And so we can see a materialization of these subtle properties that we call presence, power, knowledge, harmony, that actually animates everything that shows up. So now coming to a quaternary interpretation of quantum dynamics. So in this interpretation of quantum dynamics, we have quanta, which is a mechanism by which the infinity of information that exists in these conceptual mathematical spaces created by light traveling faster than c can show up materially. So they're parsed into material existence. We have the quaternary expression that goes through the imaginary layers and then shows up as all the more and more complex layers of matter and life. And we have this quantum object code that any quantum object is going to be represented by, and it can be determined by space-time, energy, gravity on knowledge, power, presence, harmony, coordinates. And then what becomes apparent is that there's persistent computation that's happening because of the interaction of these different layers. So it's almost like a complex adaptive system or a system of feedback. And here I want to, before we move forward, highlight a quote by Niels Bohr: "If quantum mechanics hasn't profoundly shocked you, you haven't understood it yet." And so if this scheme hasn't shocked you, then please consider this quote by Niels Bohr. So now the question is, what are some implications of this? So first of all, what it means is that atoms have to or can be leveraged differently. Why? Because an atom is an instance of a successful quantum computer. But let's look into that in a little more detail. So if we consider an atom, we know that its nuclei are made from quarks bonded together through the action of bosons. Electrons, another type of quantum particle, exist in stable orbits, so it's fundamentally made from quantum particles. The electrons exhibit something called superposition because they can exist in multiple states. We know that atoms of a single atomic number have the same properties regardless of where in the universe they are. So there's some kind of implicit entanglement that's going on. And also we know that these states of superposition, entanglement endure. And so we have an instance of a very successful quantum computer because this quantum computer atom continuously changes its state when it's subjected to photons, and it doesn't decohere in any way. And so we have this instance of stable quantum computers that's robust, that's scalable, and we know it's scalable because it's the basis of molecules and molecular plans and so on. So now the question is, if we have these naturally occurring quantum computers, which are atoms, and then also molecules, molecular plans, and so on, then what are they actually doing? So what exactly is an atom computing? And I want to suggest that it's running by and computing code continually. And the example I gave was that if you have an atomic number of 47, it maintains its behavior. So we can think about this constancy in behavior as being a result of running the same code. This code can be thought of as pre-genetic code, and it exists for the same purposes as genetic code in cells. And the question is, what are other naturally occurring quantum computers? And as I suggested, these are molecules that comprise of atoms, then the molecular plans that comprise of molecules, and then cells that comprise of molecular plans. And so what are cells computing? They are also computing genetic code that maintains the integrity, possibilities, boundaries. And then there's a range of interaction, inputs, environmental interactions that will change the nature of that code. Now, this also brings us to the idea of quantum intelligence. So it appears that intelligence is continually codified and upheld by a series of naturally surfacing and progressively more sophisticated quantum computers. So what does this imply? This implies that there must be some repository of quantum intelligence natively at the quantum levels. And in this point of view, the intelligence, which is a native property of the quantum levels, is surfacing more of its complexity as the layer of quantum computers becomes more sophisticated. So if this was the case, then the question is, how would AI compare to QI? We know that AI is a subset of conceptual mechanisms that derive from human intelligence, but we also know that human intelligence derives from this thing that may exist, which is called quantum intelligence. And so by definition, quantum intelligence, from which all other intelligence arises, is probably vastly more intelligent than anything that arises from it. So this implies that AI, or any singularity that ignores the possibility of this QI, will be leapfrogged by it as we learn to leverage what I'm calling here as QI. And here I want to draw attention to a quote by Werner Heisenberg. The first gulp from the glass of natural sciences will turn you into an atheist, but at the bottom of the glass, God is waiting for you. Now, let's move into considerations in designing a QI-type quantum computer, and I'm going to go through this fairly quickly. So we have to go through a process of intuitively understanding what exists at the quantum level. We have to learn to read it. We have to learn to appropriately leverage these fourfold and other dynamics that exist there. And we want to create quantum tech or computer that naturally integrates quantum intelligence into its functioning. And so this would be nano-sized, it would read and respond to organicness, and therefore I would call it an IQCI nanocyborg. And I've taken a crack at the design of this, and I filed a non-provisional patent with the US PTO. And I want to draw attention here to a quote by Richard Feynman. Nature isn't classical, damn it. And if you want to make simulation of nature, you'd better make it quantum mechanical. And by golly, it's a wonderful problem because it doesn't look so easy. Now, possibilities of nanocyborgs, they would allow revolutionary access to generation of materials and change foundations of material sciences because it's acting from the bottom up. It would allow revolutionary access to management and maintenance of life because, again, it's approaching the cell and genetic code from a different angle. And it would potentially be able to facilitate emergence of other forms of intelligence, as I suggested, that may exist at the quantum levels. So this also reminds of a quote by Stephen Hawking. Quantum physics might seem to undermine the idea that nature is governed by laws, but that is not the case. Instead, it leads us to accept a new form of determinism. Given the state of a system at some time, the laws of nature determine the probabilities of various futures and past rather than determining the future and past with certainty. The point being is that if we were to create devices like nanocyborgs, then we would have an additional mechanism by which to change, to speak with, to change fundamental patterns that would then perhaps accelerate how change might take place, and that too more consciously. And so there's further possibilities with nanocyborgs. I'll mention these really quickly. Since we have these nanocyborgs that will give access to fourfold patterns that animate matter and life, and we know that these fourfold patterns lie in root form as space-time energy gravity patterns, it can bring about revolution in a couple of areas. First of all, being the origin of fourfold patterns, it can be thought of as providing an inexhaustible energy source. So it's going to provide new ways of energy. And then if we can leverage this, it would, beyond terrestrial use, could be used for extended space travel. And similarly, since we would be able to more deeply interact with quantum properties, then we would be able to potentially co-create in partnership with underlying quantum intelligence. So summary of key points. We looked at the fourfold structure of matter and life and structure of light that led to a quaternary interpretation of quantum dynamics. And here we see quanta as a bridge mechanism. There's a fourfold expression that originates in the imaginary layers. Space-time energy gravity code surrounds every quantum object. And there's persistent computation leading to refinements and emergence of new form. Technological possibilities, we can begin to leverage atoms, molecules, molecular plans, and cells differently than we now do once we realize that they're quantum computers themselves. This will provide bottom-up access to genetic type code and quantum intelligence, and also facilitate the emergence of a QI type quantum computer. And then this is, I call nanocyborg, and it would provide additional avenues to manipulate material sciences, maintenance of life, and quantum intelligence, and possibly also provide inexhaustible energy source, space travel, quantum feedback mechanisms, and access and manipulation of different quantum patterns. To end, I'll end with this quote: quantum mechanics is certainly imposing, but an inner voice tells me that it is not yet the real thing. Thank you.